Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Caesar Carino, your host, and our guest today is a very special guest because he doesn't fit into the age category, but he certainly has a lot to offer us in terms of Wadsworth history, and that's our City Law Director, Norman Brague. Norman, you are presently the Norman Brague of Wadsworth. You are indeed the Norman Brague of Wadsworth, but you are certainly the city Law Director of Wadsworth, but you weren't always a law director. Were you ever a little boy?
Long time ago.
Long time ago. Would you mind telling us when you were born, where you were born, who your parents were, where you lived, and all that other kind of, when you came to Wadsworth and all of that?
Okay, I was born on October 16 of 1946 in Marietta, Ohio.
Right in Marietta.
Right in Marietta at the Marietta Memorial Hospital.
Now, Marietta seems to have a particular portion of Ohio's history, does it not?
Oh, yes.
And we'll be talking a little bit about that as well, because it was the first capital of the state of Ohio, as I remember.
Well, it was the first capital of the Northwest Territory.
Of the Northwest Territory.
The capital was at Chillicothe.
The other thing we're going to be talking about today, and excuse me for interrupting, the other thing we're going to be talking about today, since we have some of this free legal advice, we're going to be talking about the Connecticut Western Reserve as well, because Wadsworth is at the apex of the Connecticut Western Reserve, as I understand it. And you were born in the first capital of the Northwest Territory. Norman, tell us who your parents were, where you were born. I mean, I realized Marietta, and when you came to Wadsworth, and what your parents did, and so forth and so on.
Okay. My father's name was Clive Brague, C-L-I-V-E.
That's only the second Clive I've ever known in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's an unusual first name. It's more common in England than in this country.
Yes. It's also the name of the just immediate past, I guess that's redundant, the immediate retired president of Shawnee State College. His first name is Clyde, C-L-I-V-E, Very, V-A-R-I.
And my mother's name was Kate Brague.
Now, was it actually Kate? Was not Catherine, just Kate, K-A-T-E?
Well, I think actually when her birth was recorded, it was recorded as Catherine. She was named for one of her aunts, and her aunt's name was officially Catherine, but her aunt always went by the name Kate, and I suppose because my mother really liked the aunt, she always went by that name. And there were very, very few people who would have known that her name was recorded. They didn't really have a birth certificate at that time, but it was recorded as Catherine, and she always went by the name Kate, had that on her driver's license on her.
Everything else. You came to Wadsworth when?
1959.
1959, so at that time you were how old, 13?
12.
12, almost 13 years of age. And you went into the schools at that time, and why did you come to Wadsworth? Why did your family come to Wadsworth?
Well, my family had lived in Monroe County, Ohio for a very long time, which is along the Ohio River, upriver from Marietta. And the time I was born, my parents lived in Woodsfield, which is the county seat of Monroe County. Of course, I was born in Marietta because that was where the hospital was. I do have relatives in Marietta, but I never actually lived in Marietta. And so I lived in Woodsfield and also for a while in another community in southern Ohio called Byesville, Ohio.
Byesville, I know Byesville.
And but I came to Wadsworth from Woodsfield, Ohio,
from Woodsfield.
1959.
And what caused you to come to Wadsworth?
Well, Monroe County at that time was having some pretty severe economic problems. My father had moved back there in 1957 when there was a real economic boom going on in Monroe County because of the Olin Matheson aluminum plant, which was being built along the Ohio River. But in the later 1950s, I think as a combination of people kind of overbuilding and too much expectation of what was going to happen at that plant, and also problems at the Olin Matheson Company, Monroe County underwent a pretty sharp economic decline. And my father had two sisters who lived in Wadsworth at that time. So I had been around Wadsworth before I lived in Wadsworth. We visited
Who were
her
the
very
sisters,
frequently.
and are they still here?
No, the one sister's name was Myrtle Eddington, and she has been deceased for about 20 years now. And the other sister was Doris Campbell. She's still living. She's my only living aunt, but she is not living in Wadsworth anymore.
I see. Then, when you came to Wadsworth, your father began work here, is that right?
Well, he was only here very briefly. He died shortly after we moved here.
I see.
He operated a service station for a while he was here after he moved here.
In Wadsworth?
No, located over in Summit County. It was a service station that his sister, Mrs. Eddington, and her husband owned over in Summit County. But we had not lived here very long until he developed lung cancer, and he died when I was 15 years old. And of course he was taken back and buried in southern Ohio, so he had very, very little connection with Wadsworth. My mother, of course, was here much longer. She was here until her death in 1982, and she, during her time in Wadsworth, taught elementary school at Overlook School.
At Overlook School. What grade did you teach?
I believe she taught 5th grade. I'm not sure she taught that all the years she was there, but I know at least part of the years she taught.
Now, you didn't go to elementary school here, did you?
No.
Probably went right into the junior high at the time. Who was the junior high principal at the time?
Dick Holmes.
Dick Holmes was, who then later became the superintendent of Green Local, which is in Smithville. But then before that, he was the principal of the high school here in Wadsworth. But he was at that time. Who was the assistant principal? Do you remember that?
David Walters.
Dave Walters, who's now retired, and we had him on our program. As a matter of fact, we had Dick Holmes, too. We had all of the retired administrators from Wadsworth, starting with, well, all of the ones who were living. And there were 5 of them living, so we were greatly pleased to have those people. What was your first impression when you came from an Ohio River town, which of course is completely different, to a highly sophisticated town? I'm saying that with tongue-in-cheek, of course, such as Wadsworth. What was your impression, Norman?
Well, as I say, I was around Wadsworth some as far back as I can remember, so when I moved to Wadsworth, Wadsworth was not really new to me because we visited back and forth a lot, and I had been here quite a bit. But I would say that, of course, I was coming from Woodsfield, which is not right on the Ohio River. It's about 18 miles from the Ohio River.
Upriver.
Yeah,
That would be northeast, right?
Northeast from Marietta, yeah. It's right in the center of the county, center of Monroe County. But I would say that Wadsworth was a much larger place than the community I came from, and it probably gives me even today a little different perspective on Wadsworth than many people have, because so many people who live in Wadsworth have come from larger cities and kind of came out to the suburb and think of this as a real rural area that is getting urban. Well, from my viewpoint, Wadsworth always was kind of urban because I came from the more rural area, and I can tell you when my parents moved here, they thought they were moving to the big city.
To the big city.
Compared to the county and the community where we lived in southern Ohio.
The big city of Wadsworth at that time, which would have been in 1959, you say?
59.
1959, probably was just beginning to grow from maybe 6,000 or 8,000. Is that correct? You remember what the population of Wadsworth was when you came?
I believe the 1960 census was about 10,000.
10,000. So that was a big city for you.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about the school experiences. You were always very, very quiet, bright, and focused. What were your experiences in school?
Well,
and what did you enjoy doing in school?
Well, I enjoyed history the most.
And who were your history teachers?
History and government. Well, I had a number of history teachers. I remember I had Rex McIlvaine for one history teacher. Probably the one I probably remember the best is Jack Schaefer, because I had him my senior year in high school.
Now, did you feel that that helped propel you into the area which you presently are enjoying, law, or would you have become a lawyer even if you would have been down in Woodsfield with no one to help you?
Oh,
That's a loaded question, Norman.
Oh, I might very well have been a lawyer in Woodsfield. Yeah, that's quite possible. But I think being interested in history was definitely a factor in going into the law, because so many of the people that I was interested in history were lawyers. I also had a number of lawyers in my extended family. My father had a cousin who was a longtime lawyer and judge in Akron, Ohio. In fact, it was kind of through the connection with him that my father's sister ended up coming up to this part of the state.
And who was that judge and lawyer?
His name was Ernest Zessiger.
Zessiger.
Mm-hmm. My father's mother was of Swiss ancestry, as are many of the people in Monroe County, and that was her name. They were German-speaking Swiss, Zessiger.
Right. Now, the high school experience in Wadsworth ended at what year?
1965.
And in 1965, you went on to?
Ohio University in Athens, Ohio.
And did what?
Well, I got a degree, Bachelor of Business Administration at Ohio University.
Which makes you extraordinary in that you do have an accounting background with a law degree, and that makes you probably as saleable as anyone could possibly be, because most of the problems that lawyers have are always involving money somewhere. When you finished Ohio University, you went, you went on then to where to get your law degree?
The Ohio State University.
The Ohio State University. You say it the right way. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Ohio Revised Code, there is a whole section in there on the Ohio State University, and it is referred to as the Ohio State University. When in 1979, several of the other the other schools became state-assisted universities, they also had to use the word "the" in front of it. The University of Akron, the University of Toledo, the Kent State University, and so forth. People don't do that, but officially that's what it is. What did you do after you graduated from law school? I know that you probably came back to Wadsworth, but you had some rather, shall we say, cordial relationships with many of the attorneys, and a couple of those were very, very old, and probably a couple of them might have been the dean of attorneys in Wadsworth. And we'd like to hear a little bit about those kinds of people and what you did when you came to Wadsworth.
Okay, I graduated from Ohio State in June of 1971, and of course then I had to take the bar exam, which I took in late July of 1971. Of course, I had been coming back to Wadsworth in the summers when I was in law school. And I passed the bar exam and was admitted to the bar October 30th of 1971. And I started law practice with a lawyer in Akron named Charles Parker. And I was associated with him for 11 months from 1st of December 1971 until the end of October 1972, and during that period I continued to live in Wadsworth, and I just really wanted to stay in Wadsworth rather than practice in Akron, and I felt if I was going to practice in Akron I really ought to go over there and live and become involved in the Akron community, and I really preferred to stay in Wadsworth. So I looked for an opportunity to practice here in Wadsworth, and I found that opportunity with Merle Agan, who was the senior attorney in Wadsworth. He had been in practice since 1930. He was Wadsworth's first city solicitor when Wadsworth became a city, and Richard Dickey was also associated with him in his office. We were in the building that he owned on Main Street, just south of the Allen and Hartzell building. At that time, I believe Business Utilities was on the first floor of it.
And the B&B store was there before that.
Before that, yes.
And before Merle Agan moved in there, Dr. Durning had his offices up there. if you remember that. That was before your time. Dr. Durling had his offices up there. You mentioned that word solicitor. You were the city solicitor in Wadsworth for a long time, and then it was changed to the law director. Tell us the origin or the genesis of the word solicitor, and then tell us why we changed it to law director.
Well, the word solicitor comes from England, and in England, of course, the legal profession is divided into two different branches that are separately licensed and are quite separate, and they are solicitors and barristers. And basically, the barristers are trial attorneys who appear in the higher courts, and the solicitors do office work, basically paperwork. They prepare cases for the barristers, and they appear in some of the lower courts in England. And for some reason in Ohio years ago, this title solicitor was used for attorneys who represented municipal corporations, and I guess over the years they decided that was really not a very descriptive term. So I was elected in 1975 as solicitor, but during my first term the legislature changed the title to Director of Law, and that's what it's been since then.
You have been the city solicitor / Director of Law longer than any other living person in the city of Wadsworth. Is that correct?
That's true.
Matter of fact, probably longer than any other person ever in the city of Wadsworth. Is that correct? How many years have you been the city solicitor?
Well, I've actually been the solicitor and law director for a little bit over 22 years, but before that I was assistant solicitor, and if you count the time that I was assistant solicitor, I will have been there for 25 years in October.
To whom were you the assistant when you were the assistant solicitor?
I was appointed as assistant solicitor by Joe Foreman, and I was the fourth person to hold that office in a year. There had been a lot of turnover in that office. And then I was also, he resigned at the end of 1973. I was appointed October 2nd, 1973. He resigned at the end of that year, and John Goulden became city solicitor, and I was assistant under him for 1 year. And then he resigned, and Charles Johnston was appointed solicitor for a year, and I was his assistant, and then I was elected myself as solicitor in 1975.
Have you ever had an opponent?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define opponent. There was one time that an attorney who was not a resident of Wadsworth filed a petition with the Board of Elections to run against me. However, the Board of Elections ruled that he was not able to run because he was not a resident of Wadsworth. So although he had filed a petition, his name did not appear on the ballot.
Does it occur to anyone except me that an attorney might have known that before he filed the petition?
Well, I was surprised when he filed that, and I have never really understood why he did that. But
you have strong support from both parties in Wadsworth because you are extremely fair, hardworking, dedicated, and all those other kinds of things. We're going to come to that in a few minutes. But before we do that, I would like to go back a little bit farther into your history and find out a little bit more about Merle Agan. Merle Agan was the dean or the senior member, having come here in 1930. And we've had many references to Merle Agan, but we have had a few people, maybe only one other person, who really had a personal relationship with him in a business sense, that is, in the professional sense. Could you tell us a little bit about Merle Agan and some of the, well, the idiosyncrasies, some of the strengths, some of the kindnesses, some of the things we don't know about Merle Agan?
Well, Merle Agan was a native of Ada, Ohio, out where Ohio Northern University is located.
Western part of the state.
Yeah. And he had grown up out in that area, went to school out there, and then he went to Case West, or it was just Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and he practiced law for a little while in Cleveland, Ohio. And of course, at that time, I know he told me how very crowded it was in Cleveland. There were so many young attorneys, and of course, this was just at the very start of the Great Depression. And he felt that Wadsworth was a place where there was an opportunity for him to come and practice, and so he came to Wadsworth. He practiced for many years out of an office in the Citizens Bank building. I think he moved in there about the time the building was first completed. He came in 1930, and Wadsworth had become a city. It had moved up from a village to a city as a result of the 1930 census. And he was the very first city solicitor of the city of Wadsworth.
Wadsworth became a city in 1931.
Because the 1930 census indicated it had a population of over 5,000, and that made it a city.
Now tell me if this is accurate, please, Norman, because you would know the facts. If anyone knows the facts, you do. I was born on the 5th day of 1931. It became a city. Did I pretty well topple or tipple over the census to make it a city, do you think?
Well, they took the census in 1930, so that would have been the year before. And I don't know. I think it was there was a time period, of course, between the time they made the census count and they actually proclaimed it as a city. But I know as a result of the 1930 census. So it might have been actually 1931 before they made the transition to city government. And Mr. Egan talked to me some about his experiences in those days, and of course those were very difficult times. This was the Great Depression. The village, the city of Wadsworth, had money in a bank that failed, and you can imagine the situation if you have a municipality that has problems meeting its obligations because the bank it has its money in has failed.
Do you know how much money there was in the bank that was
No, I don't know. But I know he told me that when they reorganized the bank, which ultimately became the Citizens Bank, that the law firm of Squire, Sanders and Dempsey in Cleveland was involved in representing the city some on that, so they've been around representing the city for a long time. He also, I know, in his very early years in Wadsworth, defended a man who was charged as an accessory in a very famous murder case here. I don't know all the details of it. I know some of the circumstances.
Where was that murder? In the south end of town, was it not?
No, I think, I'm not sure they ever determined where the murder actually took place. The body was found, I understand, in a field west of town.
And do you remember who that murder was?
I don't recall the name. It was a young woman who was murdered, and her baby was left on a porch here in town, I understand.
I see. Was she from Wadsworth?
My understanding is she was from Barberton.
From Barberton, okay. Now, what else can you tell us about the personal life of Merle Egan?
Well, he was married to Ruth Egan, and of course they were married many, many years. They were married before they came to Wadsworth, and she worked with him in his office. In his law practice, he did a great deal of probate work. I think in his younger years he had done more of a variety of things, but in his later years it was pretty much probate work. And she helped him out a great deal in the office, and she also worked on income tax returns for many people. And did, in those days, income tax returns were done more by lawyers and law offices, and she helped a lot on those. And they, in that office, they had a kitchen area kind of in the back there, so they would stay there a lot, and they could eat meals there, and they spent a lot of time there. One thing about Mr. Egan, of course, was that he tended to not throw things away, and he had an absolutely amazing collection of things that most people would have discarded long ago. I can remember when I was there in 1972, he still had old Cleveland municipal court forms from the 1920s.
Wow.
He had all kinds of very old books and old forms and old things of various nature around his office.
What one thing did you take from him that you still use? Was it a thought or a procedure or something of that nature?
Well, I think he was very thorough. He was very honest, I think, and very
Well, you did take honesty
thorough,
with him.
Very thorough.
Of course, you probably were born with honesty, is that right?
Well, I don't know that anyone is born with honesty, but I...
You developed it at an early age.
A lot of people, I think, impressed me with honesty. I think that's also some of my heritage from my father. He was a very, very honest and very ethical person.
From Merlegan, you went where then, Norman?
Well, in 1973, I decided to open my own office. And
where was that at the time?
It was in what I would call the Ladrack building, which is on the southeast corner of Broad and Main Street.
Right. And did you work by yourself, or did you have a partner?
Well, I was there by myself, and I opened that office the 1st of September 1973, and then I was appointed assistant solicitor October 2nd, 1973. So almost immediately I was assistant solicitor after I was in there.
We'd like to hear more about your personal life, but we have so many things to talk to about what you're doing here in Wadsworth. Tell us specifically what it is that the law director is responsible for. Now, we know that if there's a fight or if there is something that needs to be handled in court, you do that. But what does the Ohio Revised Code tell us that the law director is supposed to do?
Well, the law director has basically two functions. First of all, he is the general legal counsel to the city government, and in that capacity, of course, he renders advisory opinions, sometimes in writing, but usually orally to city officials on all of the multitude of questions that can come up, and there's an amazing variety of them that can come up. He's involved in reviewing and preparing ordinances and resolutions for the city council and a variety of documents that the city is involved in, contractual and otherwise. We do have some specialized areas, of course, where we do get outside counsel and always have done so. The other area is that the law director is by law prosecutor of misdemeanor cases in the municipal court, and this is for not only cases from in the city, but also from all of the townships that are in the municipal court territory. So the law director is responsible for the City of Wadsworth, Wadsworth Township, Sharon Township, Guilford Township, Westfield Township, Harrisville Township, and Homer Township.
That's in the southern part of the Medina County.
Yes.
Pretty well so. Do you remember any extraordinary cases, and I'll help you along with a few of them, a case in which an Amishman way out in Harris Township or Harrisville Township had a hearing in court, and what can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that was the State versus Swartzentruber case, and it's actually out of Homer Township. Where
Was it it was not Harrisville then,
yeah.
Homer Township.
And there's a very significant Amish population in Homer Township, and they are the most conservative group of Amish. They are called Swartzentruber Amish. They're not all named Swartzentruber, but they're called Swartzentruber because one of their early bishops was named Swartzentruber, and this particular defendant's name also happened to be Swartzentruber. And the case involved a state hunting regulation which requires deer hunters to wear a orange color. They call hunter orange when they hunt deer. And this young Amish man hunted deer without wearing the hunter orange color. And he was cited for that. And an attorney in Medina, Richard Marco, came to represent him, and the issue in court, of course there was no dispute but what he was hunting deer and not wearing the hunter orange, but it was a constitutional issue as to whether this state regulation was constitutional because it was contrary to his religious beliefs and the rules of that particular Amish group to wear the hunter orange color. And we looked at it pretty carefully, tried to resolve the thing. I went out a number of times and talked to the senior Amish bishop in Homer Township and got a real interesting explanation. He's a very friendly man and really gave me a lot of background on what their thinking on it was. But ultimately the court decided that the state rule did apply to him, and that under the law as it was at that time, that he was subject to the law. And my understanding was that after that, the understanding was that if they could not hunt deer without wearing this hunter orange, they just wouldn't hunt deer anymore.
I see. Is my recollection correct? Did you take the court out there?
Yes, there was.
And why?
Well, the problem was, and we had had another case with the Amish too, in which there was an Amish man as a witness, and they, this particular group of Amish would not ride in an automobile to the court in Wadsworth. They would come to the court in Wadsworth, but they would come with their horse and buggy, or their horse and wagon, hack they would call it. On the previous case where an Amish man was a witness, he had done that, and the thinking was that maybe this was a little bit hazardous for them to be coming to Wadsworth with the horse and wagon, and it would be a little bit better to go out there. The bishop permits them, for some purposes, they can ride in a car, and they actually have a bus service that runs through there, and they will ride on that. But somehow the bishop didn't think that this particular situation justified riding in a car or a bus, so if they came to court in Wadsworth, they were coming in horse and buggy or wagon.
Who was the judge at the time?
That was James Kimbler.
Judge James Kimbler. He took the court out there. I suspect that of course, I think that if your own mother, Esther Soul, were to appear before you, that you probably would hold her responsible for every aspect of the law because of your extraordinary honesty in that regard. But did you have some feelings about this? The fact that you're a very religious man and you respect other people's religions, and did you have any feelings about the fact that this man was doing this for religious reasons, and we or they or the court or whatever told him that he had to pay the fine or whatever? Did he have to pay a fine? Is that what he had to do?
I think there was ultimately, I don't know whether it may have been suspended.
Suspended.
I'm not sure about that. Well, this is, it's a real complicated issue, and there were a lot of aspects to it. One of the aspects to it, of course, was that it wasn't really necessary for the Amish to hunt deer, and they had the option all the way along as to whether to hunt deer, and I think among themselves there was some difference of opinion about whether to hunt deer or not hunt deer. But it's obviously a very sensitive area, and it's an area in which the law has changed somewhat since then.
Oh, is that right? How?
Well, the Supreme Court has since that time rendered a decision which makes it more difficult for people to gain an exemption from a law based on a religious belief.
Oh, really?
And then Congress passed a law to try to minimize the impact of that Supreme Court ruling, and the President approved that law, and yet the Supreme Court of the United States held that law unconstitutional. So it's a real matter of concern. I mean, the deer hunting issue is a relatively minor issue, but I can see it as a very, very sensitive issue in some other areas.
Oh, indeed you can. Norman, I gave you the first clue. Now, tell us some other very interesting cases that you have had.
Well, I've had many very interesting cases. I think of some of them. I think one of the most unusual cases I had was a case involving a man who was practicing dentistry without a license.
In Wadsworth?
Well, he was operating out of his car. Rather than an office. Actually, what he was doing, he was
Did it have one of those reclining
teeth.
seats? Is that in his car that he used for a dental chair? Is that what he's doing?
Actually, he was making false teeth, and that's
I see.
considered the practice of dentistry. He could have done it if he was working for a dentist, but he was doing it on his own, driving around and making arrangements with people and making false teeth for them. And that was certainly an unusual
How did it end up then? Was he a Wadsworth man?
No, he was not a Wadsworth resident. I think he was a Barberton resident, if I remember correctly.
Do you remember any other ones? And then we're going to go to some of the more shall we say, sensational cases that you've been involved with?
Well, there's so many cases. Of course, we have a lot of DWI cases, but I can remember some particular circumstances in DWI cases that were pretty memorable. I remember once in a trial, we had a defendant on a DWI case who had refused to take the breath test. And he was asked why he had refused to take the breath test, and he had a good answer to that. The answer was he had talked to his lawyer, and his lawyer had told him not to take the test. And if he had just said that, we couldn't have inquired into what the conversation was with his lawyer. But unfortunately for him, he decided to elaborate a little bit in his testimony, and that he said that he talked to his lawyer on the phone, and he said that after he told his lawyer how much he'd had to drink, the lawyer told him he'd better not take that test. So, needless to say, he was found guilty.
What about your cases with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, regarding our cable vision? Do you remember anything significant about those?
I've not had much involvement with anything involving cable television because we have an outside law firm that handles.
But Wadsworth has been involved with those kinds of things.
Yeah, we have there's a law firm in Washington, D.C. that represents the city of Wadsworth on cable-related matters. And I would say that Wadsworth was a little bit different than most communities because back in 1981 and 1982, when we were first considering a cable television franchise, most communities pretty much just accepted what the cable company proposed to them. But Wadsworth looked at it very thoroughly, and we hired a firm in Washington that specialized in this area of the law, and they worked out a much more favorable franchise for us than other cities have, and they have, of course, represented the city then through the years as issues have come up regarding cable TV. But I've not personally, the law, one of the things that is happening in the law is it's becoming more specialized, and there are more and more areas that you really can't get much involved in unless you really specialize in those areas. And this is one of these really specialized areas.
Very highly specialized. Norman, what about the various judges for whom you have, or I guess in front of whom you have argued in Wadsworth? Could you name our first judges that we've had here in the municipal court, and then we went to a county court?
Well, when I started...
Or rather, we went from a county court to municipal, didn't we?
Yeah. When I started, we had a very unusual situation in Wadsworth. We had one of the last non-lawyer judges in the state of Ohio.
And that was?
Robert Ott.
Robert Ott, who was a justice of the peace.
Yes. And the reason he was able to be a judge was back in, I think it was 1957, when the justices of the peace were abolished, there was a provision, kind of a grandfather clause, you might call it, that a justice of the peace who was not a lawyer could continue as a county court judge. And at that time, all of Medina County was within the Medina Municipal Court territory except for the city of Wadsworth and Wadsworth Township. And it was called the Medina County Court. And Judge Ott moved from being Justice of the Peace to Judge of the County Court. And initially, he heard cases from Wadsworth Township, but he had concurrent jurisdiction with the Mayor's Court in Wadsworth. And the Mayor's Court, they decided to cease to use the Mayor's Court and to file all the cases with him. So by the time I was there, he had an office and court area in City Hall. He had another full-time job. So the court did all of its business in the evenings and sometimes on Saturday. It was a very small operation. He had one clerk, and 2 deputy clerks, and he was only there in the evening. He had court 3 evenings a week. And the court had one very big problem, a very big problem, and that was that defendants had a right to have a trial by jury. And the court just didn't really have the resources to have jury trials. So all a defense attorney had to do to stop a prosecution was just file a jury demand, and the case would never go to trial. They didn't have a speedy trial requirement. And when I became prosecutor, there were 27 cases, some of them 4 years old, upon which jury demands had been filed. And when a jury demand was filed, they just got on this list. They never went anyplace. And the police were so frustrated because they would arrest people and charge them with offenses, and they could never get them to trial. They just stayed on this list. And the judge had another full-time job, so he wasn't available in the day to try the jury trials, and they built up this big backlog. And he was judge for about 6 months when I was in office, and he resigned then in early 1974, and Richard Dickey was appointed as judge. And he was judge through the balance of 1974, and then in the 1974 election, C. David Hensel was elected judge of the court, and he took office 1st of January 1975. Well, there was a lot of talk during this time period that we really needed a municipal court, and there was some talk about maybe adding a second judge in Medina and Wadsworth, losing its court, but local attorneys, of course, were opposed to that, and local people in the community. We wanted our own court, and we were able, with the help of Bill Batchelder, to get the state legislature to provide for a Wadsworth Municipal Court, which had jurisdiction not only in Wadsworth City and Township, but in these other townships that I mentioned earlier, as well as Lodi and Seville and Westfield Center and Gloria Glens and a little bit of Rittman that's in Medina County. And the Wadsworth Municipal Court came into existence the 1st of January 1977, and of course I've been there from the beginning on that court. And then of course after Judge Hensel died at the end of 1985, Judge James Kimbler then was judge for 11 years, and now Stephen McElveen.
So now we've had then Barat, who was not an attorney, was a justice of the peace, and he had another part-time job. Then an interim judge who was Judge Richard Dickey.
Yes.
And then after Richard Dickey, we had David Hensel, C. David Hensel. And David Hensel died on the last day of the year, did he not?
Yes.
And then the following day, what happened?
Well, Judge McClure from Medina was the acting judge. He had actually been serving as a visiting judge. Judge Hensel, I think he had taken vacation. I don't think he had taken sick leave. I think he had taken some vacation. So Judge McClure came back, and he, of course, had appointment from the Supreme Court to continue then until a judge was appointed by the governor. So Judge McClure was there for, I think, about 6 weeks, and then the governor, it was Governor Celeste at that time, appointed James Kimbler, and then as soon as he had received his certificate from the governor and had completed the formalities, then he took office as judge.
And he remained judge for quite some time,
yes.
didn't he? Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, he left the bench to go to Medina as a judge there, the probate
Yes.
judge, is that correct?
No, the Court of Common Pleas General Division.
Okay, the Common Pleas Judge of the General Division. And now we have Judge McElveen. So you've gone through 4 of them.
Yes.
Now, as you look at these judges, what are the kinds of differences of approach that you have to have for each one? I suspect that everyone is completely different, is that correct?
They are different, and I would also say not only have I had cases with these 4 judges, but over the years we've had quite a variety of visiting judges that have come to the court. These are judges of other courts, usually retired judges, sometimes sitting judges, that are appointed by the Supreme Court of Ohio, either because a sitting judge is ill or is taking vacation, or sometimes has a conflict in a case that it's felt it would be better for another judge to hear them. So they're all different. Judge Ott was, of course, a real unique situation because he was not a lawyer himself, and he also was part-time and was only there in the evenings, and the court at that time had very little support staff. He did not have a bailiff. So, I mean, we had a situation where I can remember a woman becoming very hysterical in a court proceeding, and he had to literally physically restrain her from hurting herself. And so he was really pretty much on his own without much support staff at all.
Did he know the law?
Yes, he had some knowledge of the law. Now, he didn't have the legal research background that he would have had if he went to law school, and he also did not have available to him the law library resources that would typically be available. So I would have to say he was more dependent on attorneys to point out the law to him than would have been the case had he been a lawyer, certainly. But he had worked very hard to study those aspects of the law that came before him on a regular basis.
So then perhaps one of the things that you could say is that the differences among the four judges that you're talking about is that in Judge Bob Ott's court, you were dealing with a person who was not a lawyer and therefore did not have the legal background. That was completely changed then with Judge Richard Dickey,
yes,
who was an attorney and probably knew the law very well and so forth. What was easier? Which was easier, when the judge knows the law or before?
Oh, I think it's easier with
if he knows the law,
being a lawyer, yes.
In other words, you couldn't. You wouldn't use your own legal knowledge to bamboozle the judge if the judge didn't know the law, would you? Of course, you wouldn't do that anyway. Let's go to some of your city responsibilities again. I think that it'd be appropriate for us to tell where the various offices were for the city solicitor / law director were, because when we write this history in 2014, we would like to have a little bit of those kinds of data. So tell us where your first office was as a city solicitor.
Well, that's kind of a long story, but the first office was in my private office in the Ladrack building, and I worked out of there. There was also a room in City Hall that was available to the prosecutor, although several other people also used it on occasion. And it was on the north side of the building in the second floor. And when the municipal court was created, the floor plan was changed and the walls were knocked out, and it was really just combined into what was the clerk's office. So it was a room that had a rather short existence, but I used it for a while. And then when I actually moved into City Hall on a regular basis, I shared a rather large room on the second floor in the front of the building with the city auditor, the city treasurer, and the city income tax department. We were all in the same room.
All in the same room. Did you have dividers?
Oh, no, there were no dividers.
Well, how did you take care of the confidentiality?
Well, there wasn't very much confidentiality.
You just had to talk very softly.
There wasn't very much confidentiality. In fact, one of the problems was people would come in to see me, and they would bring their children with them, and while they were talking to me, their children would bother the other people that were in other parts of the room. And there was, I don't know what to call it, there was some kind of a machine or a device that was used, I guess, for printing checks or something, and it was rather noisy, and it would get going, and sometimes it was hard to hear who I was talking to in there. Well, that situation existed until 1981, and in 1981 there was another remodeling in City Hall, and the city bought a commercial building north of City Hall and expanded some city offices.
And who was that? What was that commercial building, and from whom did we buy it?
Well, it had been Live Plumbing, I believe,
right,
immediately
Live Plumbing,
before
that's
the
right.
city bought it. And as a result of that, the auditor and treasurer's office and income tax was relocated down there. And this big room that I had been in was converted into a law library, basically, and there were also some smaller rooms cut out of it. And another room, which had also been used by the city income tax department, was kind of split into two rooms and a door cut into the wall. And that very, very small room then was my office from 1981 to 1988. It had no outside windows. It was kind of almost like a big closet in the City Hall building.
Now, did you have that all by yourself, or did you have that with your secretary, or what?
Well, the first few years I was in there by myself. For the first 3 years, 1981 to 1984. And then in 1984, I got my own secretary, Linda Gehring, and so she also shared that office with me from 1984 to 1988. And then in 1988, the city bought a house on Maple Street. Of course, it's on the site where part of the present City Hall building is.
From whom did we buy the house?
I believe the owner of it was I think her name was Johnson, I believe. It was not Myra Johnson, it was another woman named
Myra Johnson's house is the one on the corner,
yes,
which we were trying to preserve for the Wadsworth Area Historical Society. And the house just east of that was another Johnson, but it was not Myra Johnson's house. Is that correct?
Well, my understanding is the one immediately east of her house she owned and rented to a tenant.
Oh.
And then the next one east of that.
It was another Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I know the woman who owned it lived in Florida. She had not lived I think she had lived in the house years ago, but she lived in Florida before she sold it to the city. So I was in there from 1988 until 1994, and then in 1994 that house was demolished for the site of the new City Hall, and then while the new City Hall was under construction from 1994 to May 1995, I was temporarily housed in the former Ohio Injector Company offices at Pine and Main Street.
And you were down there again with a group of people with whom you had been earlier, is that right? You're all kind of pretty well together?
Well, I had my own,
your own
separate
office?
room down there. Of course, there were other people down there in other rooms, but I had my own room down there, and another room for my secretary.
And that brings us up to the present day. Where are you now?
Well, I'm now on the second to the top floor of City Hall in what I would call the west wing of the City Hall building. The mayor and the service and safety director are on the north side of the west wing, and I'm on the south side of the west wing.
Tell us Linda Gehring was the first secretary that you had. How long was she with you, and then what happened in terms of her job description change, and whom did you bring in, and who is there now? What is the progression of the people with whom you worked?
Well, actually, when I started, the mayor's secretary also served part-time as the solicitor's secretary.
And you remember who that was at the time?
Barbara Fish was the first one.
Who was John Henson's secretary.
Yeah, she was his secretary, and she was secretary for the time that he was in office, and then Carol Lang was secretary for a while, and then ultimately it was decided I really needed to have my own secretary, and Linda Gehring started in that position in 1984. She had previously been a dispatcher in the police department and had been the judge's secretary, and was also clerk of council, and I had known her and worked pretty close with her since 1976. And then in 1988, Brenda Fisher also was added to my office, and over time the functions kind of changed and the terminology changed, and so Linda Gehring went from being secretary to paralegal, and Brenda Fisher.
She had training for that, though, did she not?
Well, she had received training related to that. That's not something that is formally licensed like lawyers or some other things are. She did not have a degree or formal license in that, but she had received training and, of course, a lot of experience and on-the-job training that qualified her for that. And at the present time in my office, I have Brenda Fisher, who's paralegal, and also Jessica Chamberlain, who is paralegal. And, of course, I also have as assistant law directors Paige Schrock and Jennifer Hensel, who's part-time. She's Judge Hensel's daughter.
Judge Hensel's daughter.
Yes.
And we went from secretaries to secretary to secretary. Now, how about assistant law directors to assistant law directors to assistant law directors? Who's your first assistant law director?
Well, we've had assistant law directors in a couple of different senses. We've had some that have worked on a regular basis and some that have just worked because they were appointed for a particular case. And very few people probably know this, but I think the first person, if I remember correctly, that I ever appointed as an assistant law director was actually James Kimbler.
Jim Kimbler.
Way back, I was on vacation or something, and he was practicing in Lodi, and of course this was before he was a judge or before he was with the county prosecutor's office even, and we were on pretty friendly terms, and I know I had him stand in, but it wasn't on a regular basis, it was just like for one day or something. The first one I had on a regular, ongoing basis was Greg Geigel.
Greg Geig. Geigel, who was an assistant with, rather in the firm with Carl Schantz, right?
Yeah, he took over the office at Carl
Then
Schantz.
who followed him?
Christopher Brown
Chris
from
Brown.
Medina.
And then after Brown?
Well, Marianne Kovach for a little while.
Marianne Kovach, who's now with the prosecutor's office,
yeah.
and then after Marianne?
Paige Schrock.
Paige Schrock, and you've had Paige Schrock now for some period of time. We're going to run out of time quickly, and I wanted to ask you some more personal things if we could. You have no more family left in Wadsworth, is that correct?
I have cousins. I have two cousins in Wadsworth.
And who are those cousins?
Sheldon Brague, who lives on West Street, and his sister, Diana Abereg, is her.
Diana Abereg.
Abereg, that's her married name.
Abereg is her married name.
Sounds a little bit like Brague, but it's
Right.
a different name.
And tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Rotary Club and your involvement with your church. We'll have to go very, very fast because we'll run out of time, but tell us about the Rotary Club first and then your church.
Well, I've been involved with the Rotary Club for a long, long time. In fact, when I was in high school at Wadsworth High School, they had a program where they selected 2 students each month to visit the Rotary Club and 2 to the Lions Club. And I was selected as a Rotary student guest in October 1964. And I remember very well attending those meetings in 1964. Also, at that time, the Rotary Club was very much involved with the Spanish Club at the high school and making arrangements for students from Mexico to come to visit Wadsworth. And I can remember the Rotary Club sponsored kind of a Christmas party for Spanish Club students as well as Rotarians. So I had a very early memory of the Rotary Club. And when I came back to practice law in Wadsworth, I was with Merle Agan and Richard Dickey, and they were both members of the Rotary Club. So I went with them to Rotary, and I applied for membership in the Rotary Club and became a member of the Rotary Club, I believe, in February of 1973. So this year is kind of significant to me in terms of Rotary because it's 25 years that I have been a member of the Rotary Club, and I've really
almost half your life.
Yeah, really enjoyed that over the years, and I've also had the pleasure of visiting a lot of other Rotary clubs. I've been to Rotary clubs in London, England, and Hamburg, Germany, and it's been a real.
What about your church affiliation, of which you're extremely proud and certainly have every right to be, and very active?
Well, I'm a member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Akron, Ohio, on West Market Street, but I also visit many other churches on a regular basis here in Wadsworth, and I have been at one time or another a visitor in almost all of the churches in the Wadsworth community.
We have 25 of them in Wadsworth now. And did you ever want to be a minister?
No, I've never felt that I was called to be a minister.
Well, you certainly have every quality. You do a beautiful job with the prayer, not only at the council meetings, and we hear you all the time, obviously, because you're on television. But when you're called upon to do anything at all, you do it well. Norman Brague, we're at the end of our hour, unfortunately. We want to tell you how much we respect and honor the kinds of things that you have done, particularly because they have been done with the spirit of honesty and integrity. We probably will find someone in our lifetimes who will equal you, but no one who will ever surpass you. Norman, thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much for having me.